flame of the fire slew those men that took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was astounded, and rose up in haste and spake and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king counselors, being gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any God except their own God. The title of today's lesson is Daniel's Friends Trust God. Related scriptures will include Isaiah 43, verses 1 through 7, Daniel chapter 6, verses 19 through 27. The time of today's lesson is about 587 BC, and the place of today's lesson takes place in Babylon. The golden text reads, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, that they might not serve nor worship any God except their own. And that comes from Daniel chapter 3, 28. Would anybody want to give their interpretation of the golden text? So this was the point of go ahead. This was the part of the text where after the king had realized that that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were pretty much unharmed or affected from being thrown into the furnace. And after being called from the fiery furnace, and the king noticing that not their clothes or even hair of their head was affected. So in this moment, the king recognizes that the God that they serve has sent an angel to protect his people, and that they may not serve or no worship no other God except their own God. So he was just acknowledging who their God was in that moment and what he had the power to do. So for those who aren't familiar with where we are in today's lesson, this part of the lesson, we have the main characters, King Nebuchadnezzar. We have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we learned that the children of Israel are in bondage by the king of Babylon. And then, in the beginning of Daniel chapter 3, you have where the king, he makes this image of gold. And he gathers all the princes, the governors, and the captains. And he pretty much tells them, at the moment you hear music, that you should bow down and worship this image. And then word gets to the king that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being Jews, they have not worshipped this image. So then the king is of course, in anger, he summons Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, pretty much asking them, is this true? And then he also gives them another opportunity. He said, hey, when the music comes on, you have an opportunity to worship this image. And then Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego pretty much refuse because the Lord God that they worship of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was their God as well. And they were given in the book of in the law of Moses not to worship no other God before their God. And so they was just staying true to what they believed, and which made the king Nebuchadnezzar angry to where he had to be just in his rulership as king. And he said whoever did not worship his image will be thrown in a fiery furnace. So that's where we are now. The Jews refused, and they are about to be thrown into the fiery furnace because nobody is excluded from the king's declaration. We can go into our questions. Question number 1. And thank you, Mother Prince. Any other comments? Mm-hmm. 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 It's when we have faith in God, we are able to be used by God. And when we're able to be used by God, God can get glory from us. So we learn that God used his people, um, and it was a testing of their faith. Now, God is all knowing, so he knew what was going to be the outcome of the situation. Um, but how often do we say we trust God and that we know that he's all knowing, but in the time of trial, we try to figure it out ourselves. So God is saying, I am the same God that was with you before. I'm the same God that's with you now. God was going to get glory out of his people by showing his sovereignty, his power, and what he can do that no other God, which is only one God, could do.
Fire furnace, and everywhere in the sky when he came through, letting you know that those choices are still there. You have to make it.
Any other comments? So God was going to gain glory from his people by testing their faith.
Yeah.
So the same way God will test our faith to show, do we really mean what we say? And God will get glory from our lives as well. Question number 2. What caused the king to become even more angry than before?
That's the next paragraph on the irrational spirit. It said Nebuchadnezzar was furious with these men over their refusal to worship the image. But when they were brought to him and he heard their determination to stay true to their God and trust him to deliver them from the fire, he became even more enraged because they were actually saying, our God is the true God. He is the true God. He'll bring us out. If he don't, he don't. But if he do, we're gonna still go in, we're still gonna deny you.
Any other? Thank you. So the question again was, what caused the king to become even more angry? So like we heard, he was already angry that they refused to bow down and worship this image. But then after pulling them to get to further examine, like, are you sure this is what you want to do? And they stood their footing, they stood their ground and say, this is the God we serve, therefore we're not going to serve your image. But then you also look at the issue of pride. The king is dealing with a pride issue. And dealing with pride is almost like he wanted to be worshipped. And the God that he represented and believed and idolized, he wanted them to also worship. But we have to serve the God that is the one and true God. Regardless of what you may be facing, we have to honor the God that we serve. You have this king, a man who wants to be worshipped, as well as an image, and from his rage, from disobedience, it resulted in him requiring them to be killed. Any other questions or comments? You look like you had something.
Yeah, so I think probably just one thing that comes to mind too is that during that time, like the king's word was law. So for somebody to disobey the king in public, like, because the king, you have to remember, the king loved these 3 Hebrew boys. He was fond of them. He had given them those positions. But even though he did that, he still had to enforce his word because it was in public. And if he had not, that would have undermined him to his own people.
And that's why I was saying there's a pride issue also involved because, like you said, because he loved these Jew boys and they went against his decree, his declaration. And as a king, you know, it's almost like feeling like I brought you up and yet you disrespect me. It's almost like feeling like, you know, disrespected, but these Jews knew that they had a fear of God. And they would rather deal with the consequences of their God than this man threatening them in their lives. Question number 3.
Why was Nebuchadnezzar decree foolish? And so let's start the next paragraph, and you already hit on it. We talked about pride. Nebuchadnezzar's pride caused the biggest outburst. As king over the mighty Babylonian Empire, he demanded to be respected and honored. To have someone defy him was more than he could take. Pride was this kind of effect on people. When they are thwarted in any way, they will lash out at those they see as hindering them. We see in this dog-eat-dog world of politics, entertainment, and our personal lives. If Nebuchadnezzar had been rational in his thinking, he would have realized that making a furnace much more harder would serve only to bring a more rapid release from the pain of burning instead of prolonging agony. A cooler furnace would have been more efficient in its torture. But the king commanded some of his mighty military to bind the 3 Israelites and toss them in the fiery furnace.
Thank you, Brother Davidson. Any other comments?
Yeah, so Nebuchadnezzar here is like one of the most powerful rulers of the time. So his decree in making this idol would be like Biden standing up and saying like anybody who's not a Christian needs to be put to death. Well, we have a country full of Hindu people and Islamic people, so he knows he's about to get into some, you know, going back to pride. Either everybody's going to give up their gods and nobody's going to die, or he's setting people up to make a decision to listen to him or choose death, which is pretty foolish of a king who's ruling over, you know, multiple people groups. He had conquered a bunch of countries at this point, not just the Hebrews. So it's, and like what Limby said, these guys had a lot of favor with the king, Daniel especially, so he's putting himself in a bad position to make most of his people choose, like, either you're going to listen to every single thing I say, even the most important thing in your life, like which God you worship, or you're going to choose death and have uprights or whatever. Not a smart idea for a king to do.
And one thing I'll look at with pride is almost like a feeling of you being self-reliant, then dependent on God. Pride is almost like God trying to tell you to do something, but because you feel self-righteous or you feel entitled, you look at, it's almost like looking at yourself as God or replacing God with yourself. And I know with pride, it can be hindering when it comes to receiving feedback or information. And in this case, his pride turned into anger. And when you are emotional, your emotions can make you make a decision based on those emotions, whether it being logical and moral or being right. And in this case, the king, he wanted to increase the temperature of the furnace because in his mind, it was his way of getting back at these Jews for disrespecting his decree to worship this image. But what the commentator was trying to bring out was the fact that had he been thinking logically, he would have realized that by increasing the temperature, their deaths would have been instant versus if the temperature wasn't as hot, it would serve the purpose of the reason for torture. But because he was irrational and thinking irrational, his decisions became irrational. So his pride wouldn't allow him to accept the truth, therefore it became a hindrance to the judgment. Any questions or comments? Question number 4. What indicates the king's eagerness in this matter, and what loss did this result in for him?
I can get that one. It's found under unexpected deaths. Nebuchadnezzar's command to his soldiers was urgent and severe. All they could do was carry out his demands as quickly and efficiently as possible. The furnace was heated excessively, as he had demanded, and his men took up the 3 Jews to throw them in. We can imagine that this must have been a fearful assignment for the soldiers when they felt the intense heat emanating from the furnace. They had no choice, however, but to carry out the demands of Nebuchadnezzar. In doing so, they gave their lives.
Yeah.
Can you read verse 22?
Verse 22. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
And that kind of touches back on the last question where the pride turned into anger. And because of his judgment, because of him not thinking, he just acting irrational because of his anger, it turned into him acting quickly, where there was no preparation. It was just, hey, just gather the strongest men, bind these 3 Jews and throw them into this fiery furnace. But as a result of the increased temperatures, the men that he had sending the 3 Jews to the fiery furnace ended up being killed from the heat from the fiery furnace. As Brother McConnell had read in verse 22, where it says, therefore, because of the king's commandment was urgent, because it was quick, because it was rapid, he didn't take time to think about it, he just acted in emotion. It said, and the furnace exceedingly hot, The flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Slew meaning killed. So the men that were ordered or commanded to deliver these 3 Jews to the fiery furnace ended up dying because of his leadership and him acting irrational.
That shows that God was protecting them before they even got there. Like, because most of the time when we hear the story, if you don't read, okay, once they got in the fire, God went and protected them. But he was protecting them along the way. So much so that the people that was carrying out the order to kill them, on their way there, they died. So that even gives, if you want to, a real life, type example, whenever you got something going on in life, whatever, and somebody's going against you, the Lord will protect you, but then he'll let something possibly happen to them. But regardless, before you even get to whatever the big disaster is supposed to be, he's already guiding you and holding your hand through the challenge.
Thank you, Brother Davidson. Another key thing that I got from this as well, I know a lot of times, sometimes we can look at, what God can be doing with his people, but then we can also look at, what God is doing with this king. We see that pride is the spirit that he's dealing with. And we see that, even us with pride, it can affect our judgments as well. And that means receiving information where you have fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, and they can be telling you, by the word of God, hey, I've noticed some things, and there's some concerns that I may have. And that pride can be like, well, I got it under control. You don't know what you're talking about. You're wrong. And they would not receive that help. They would not receive that. They would not receive that truth.
Yeah.
So one thing we can also take from this is, because of the king relying on his pride, it turned into him making irrational decisions. So that can teach us, when we allow pride to get in our way, we may not make the best decisions also.
Right.
And when we don't make the best decisions, we're not protected by our covering in God. So it shows us the parallel between the covering that God has over his people, the people who serve their God, and someone who's relying on their belief outside of God and relying on pride or self. It just shows the parallel of being protected under God's covering and things going chaotic and when doing things outside of God's covering. So that was another thing that I got out of that. Any other questions or comments?
Our decisions just don't affect us, it affect others.
Mm-hmm.
And the irrational ones can be hurtful too.
Exactly. The king's irrational decision got his men killed because of his pride, and you had something to say?
Yeah. How many times beforehand have we actually realized up front that we are making a prideful decision or an irrational decision? The truth of the matter is, none of us look at our decisions as irrational. We feel like we know it. There's some things that we think we know and we know, but we don't give consideration to other possibilities. But we need, and I guess what I'm saying is, we can look at others and say, or Nebuchadnezzar, he made a private decision. He was irrational. It touched his emotion, and based upon these boys not buying him, he made an emotional decision, but that emotion was based upon his pride.
Yeah.
We have to look at ourselves, because, and we have to know ourselves and realize realize that under certain circumstances, we are going to become emotional and irrational. And that's not the best time to make a decision. And that we need to either wait and make a decision when we can think it through, but we surely should not make it right there. We should just leave it alone. And I'm speaking from my own experience because I realized there were some decisions that I made, and I realized at the time that I made them, I felt like it was the right decision.
Yeah.
But then hindsight revealed that they were not good decisions. And then I had to ask myself, why did you make that decision? It was because how I was feeling at the time. And when I kept doing that, I realized that when I'm in this state, this is not a good time for me to make a decision. So what I do, I've surrounded myself with wise people that I'll ask them, how do you think I should handle this? And I'll even tell them, right now I'm emotionally involved in this. And I want to make sure that when I make this decision, that I'm making the right one. I do that at work on a regular basis. Because some student will make me mad, and I want to make sure that I do not abuse my power because I have authority to provide discipline. But I want to make sure that when I provide that discipline, is that I'm critical in my thinking and that I'm not abusing power and or not making an emotional decision.
I have a question for you, Pastor.
Okay.
Now, I like to listen, and I heard you say that there's times when, to prevent making emotional decisions, you have counsel that you seek. And it's safe to say that the counsel that you seek are men of God.
Sometimes I look at who's appropriate for this particular situation. All these folk ain't saved, but they're knowledgeable of that particular thing. You can have knowledgeable people who are not people of God, but they know that content, and that they can offer some good advice.
Okay.
You can't come to the conclusion that an unsaved person always make bad decisions, because that's not true.
Right.
They made a bad decision on who Christ is in their life. But God has gifted all of us, and we have a purpose here on earth, and we have gifted people in various categories. And just because they have not accepted Christ, if they're doing other stuff, if they're working on the assignment that God has assigned them, although they may not be saved, they still doing what God wants them to do, and they can still contribute to what you are doing. So they do not have to always be saved.
So they don't always have to be saved, but as long as they're leading you towards God.
I want help in this decision. There are folks that I work with, I know what they're doing. And there's a really, really good chance that they ain't saved. But they can still help you.
So they have knowledge in that area.
Because they're knowledgeable in that area. I can take care of the God part. That's me. I may be taking care of the God part then. Because my whole objective is that I want to be just and right in what I do. I just need to get information from them. We cannot come to the conclusion that unsaved folk got all bad information. That's not true. Because unsaved folk has good information. They can provide you with some good information. But I can't make a broad cast like that.
Okay.
I look at the information. What the Bible tells us to do, don't walk in the counsel of the ungodly, or sinners where sinners are sitting in the seat of the scornful. He said, don't you do that. They may do it, but I'm not going to do it. So I'm seeking God's will. They may have enough data to help you do that I can put it together, make a decision myself. When I come to you, what you say to me is not an order. You're giving me information where I can make my own decision.
Yeah, rightfully divide truth.
Yeah. Well, you give me information, I take information and apply wisdom to it. And that means the right application of knowledge.
Sometimes God puts certain people in your life at certain times to get you through certain things.
Yeah.
So you might think that that person is there to stay completely or constantly, just to find out that that person is only there to get you through that storm, that trial. But you're trying to hold on to that.
Yeah.
So you're missing the additional blessing that's coming from that person to get you through this test.
We renovated this church. And when we renovated this church, there was no carpet on the floor, there was no pews here. We took them all out.
Yeah. I remember that.
And we put new sheetrock up there. Well, in order for us to get there, we had to bring in some scaffolding. And we would lift that, well, we didn't, they did. They lifted up the sheetrock, screwed it to that place up there, mudded. And because they were putting beads in there, they didn't have to sand it because they were going to, you can't keep them there. They're only for a period.
Good word. Any other comments or questions? Question number 5. What did the king initially see happening when the men landed in the furnace?
That's found under astonishment on page 36. It says, suddenly while Nebuchadnezzar sat upon his throne observing the grisly proceedings, he saw something that made him leap to his feet in a most unkingly manner. He was possibly a safe distance away after witnessing the death of his mighty men, but obviously he could still see inside the furnace. His astonishment no doubt began when he saw the 3 men fall safely to the floor of the furnace alive. But then something else happened, causing him to ask, did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? So that's the answer. What did the king initially see happening when the men landed in the furnace? When they landed in the furnace, and his astonishment no doubt began when he saw the 3 men fall safely to the floor of the furnace alive. And then he noticed, he said, did not we throw 3? Because, he saw 4.
And then if you can just read verse 24. That confirms what you just said.
Verse 24 says, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished and rose up in haste and spake and said unto his counselors, did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king.
So thank you, Mother Prince. As you read verse 24, if you notice where it says, and he said unto his counselors, did not we cast 3 men bound in the midst of the fire? It was almost like he had to. It was almost like he just saw something he couldn't believe, and he had to talk to his counselors like, am I seeing something? Like, do you see what I see? He saw 3 men go in, falling safely into this fiery furnace, and it went from 3 to seeing 4. He saw a 4th person. Any other comments or questions? Question number 6. What did he observe as he kept looking into the furnace?
I'll read that. I'll start at right after the next paragraph. When his counselors responded to the affirmative, Nebuchadnezzar related to them what he was observing. He saw 4 men in the furnace, not 3, walking around freely without bonds. They were moving around in the center of the flames, not on the outer fringes, trying to escape. What he saw was a picture of a perfect peace rather than of panic or trauma.
Thank you, Sister Davidson. Like she read, so like we just went from question, the previous question, 3 men went into this fiery furnace, and now he sees 4. Verse 25 reads, and this is after the king had asked his counselors, did we not throw 3 men in? In 25, he answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. So the question was pretty much asking, what did he observe as he kept looking into the furnace? He saw 4 men, and it says loosed. Now we remember before they were thrown into the furnace, he had the king Nebuchadnezzar had some strong men bind these Jews up before throwing them into the furnace. But as they further examined the furnace, and they thought they saw 3, but they actually saw 4 that was walking around loosely, meaning that they were unbound, they were untied, and unaffected in the midst of the fire. And then as we read the last part of 25, it says, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God, which kind of answers question number 7. What did Nebuchadnezzar think about the 4th man? When he saw that 4th man, he saw an image that looked like a Son of God. Now we knew King Nebuchadnezzar was a king of Babylon, meaning that he was not a Jew or a man of God. So his knowledge of their God was limited. So what he saw as an image of a Son of God to him was more like a divine being. It was something that had to be divine, something that was not familiar to his eyes, something that was unfamiliar, some divine in nature. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, because he said that they were walking around, so it wasn't like they got in. And the response, the question said they were not in a panic or this trauma, so they were walking. It wasn't like they were historical or in a panic. They were fearful. They were at peace in the midst of this storm or in the midst of this fire that they were in. So that tells us something about how we also should respond to the conditions that we find ourselves in. That we need to find peace in that situation, knowing that God has got a handle on it. Rather than get in panic, what am I going to do? Or making a rash decision because now I'm afraid of what I think may happen.
Yeah.
I want to piggyback off what she said. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in trouble over obeying God. They were captured, placed in the king's palace, and then because they would not bow, which God had told them not to do, they were cast in the furnace. What does that teach us? That there are times when we obey God, and because of our obedience, we will get in trouble. That obedience causes us to suffer trouble. But what happens? What else does it teach us? That whenever that happens, what did the king see? He said, we threw 3 in there, but in there 4. And the other one looked like
Son of God.
the Son of God. So the message that we can draw from that is when our God-given obedience gets us in trouble,
You were covered.
we have help from God, that he does not keep us from the trouble or from the fire. He sustains us in it. He's with us in the fire and preserves us in the fire.
So that's why they was walking around with their clothes and stuff unknown.
Because God has preserved them in the fire. We keep asking God not to let us get in trouble.
But we're gonna get in trouble.
He's not going to stop us.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's not going to stop us from getting in trouble. But if we were walking in obedience, and our obedience is what got us in trouble,
Right.
then he preserves us in trouble, like he preserved the Hebrew boys in the fire. God specialized in preserving us in fire, not keeping us out of trouble.
Yeah.
Sometimes he don't let us get in trouble, so we can listen the next time he said, tell us not to do it.
Yeah. So we need to know just because we're in it doesn't mean we're ungodly. We may be in the fire because we were godly.
Yeah.
But if we're in the fire because we're godly, this message that we're reading now is an encouragement to us, because God says in Malachi, I am the Lord, I change not. If you get in trouble because you did what I said, I will preserve you in it.
So don't always look at your trouble that you're in because of disobedience, because you can be in trouble because of obedience in God. But that trouble in obedience in God is different, because in that trouble, God is preserving you, as one pastor was saying.
Yeah.
And you can trust that God is with you because God was with them. And he's an unchanging, unwavering God.
And so even if we, never mind.
So just be obedient. You be obedient.
Yeah, he is obedient.
But Brother Teacher, that's such really a good point, because so often as children of God, as Christians, we, when we come and accept Christ, we think that we're not going to have any more trouble, that everything is going to be okay. That's not the case.
Yeah.
And his word said life is full of trouble.
Oh, yeah.
And remember that trouble is to see if we're going to have faith,
Yeah.
and not to get scared, because if we was in that position.
Then that's when the devil hit you the most.
Yeah.
When you get that closer relationship with God, it's
Yeah.
like every time you turn around, there's something.
That's when your trouble's coming, because the devil's after you.
I can testify to that.
So just stay under that protection. That's all I can say.
Well, that kind of brings up the verse right before the story when the king has them arrested and questions them. They're pretty much like, yeah, we did it, and I know God's going to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, I'm still going to
Now obey your God.
worship God. That's kind of what the whole book of Job is about. Job is this very righteous man, blessed by God, and then God gets in the bet with the devil, and all this bad stuff happens to him, and the whole rest of the book is, well, not the whole rest, but most of it is his 3 friends who are wise Hebrews. In their way of thinking was, we have this law, if you follow the laws, good will happen. If you don't follow the laws, bad will happen. So they're trying to convince him that that he must have done something wrong because bad is happening to you. If God didn't deliver Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he's not any less righteous. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego aren't any less right for refusing to worship the idol.
Come on.
I think that verse and them saying, but even if God doesn't deliver me, I'm still gonna do things God's way, and I think that's super relevant to my prayers. Unless you guys have perfect lives and aren't telling me about it, but your prayers. We pray sometimes, I hope my loved one doesn't die, or I hope my children don't get in trouble or killed. Why doesn't God answer our prayers sometimes? And it's just their attitude, even if God doesn't. Because the only thing that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have in common with every other person that's ever existed, well, maybe two, and every other person in the Bible, is that they all died. All the wise virgins, Pastor talked about, they all died. Sometimes God delivers us in the furnace. Sometimes He answers our prayers. Sometimes our loved ones recover and get better. Sometimes people turn their lives around after falling into substance abuse, or marriages heal, or things. But our real promise is, even though we're going to die, is we have eternal life.
Any other comments? Question number 8. What did everybody observe as the men came out of the fire?
I can get that one. It's found under protection. As the king's important leaders gathered around the young men, they observed how the men had been miraculously preserved. Now we see why the text made a point earlier of mentioning that they were thrown into the furnace fully clothed, because every article of clothing was still in place and unaffected by the fire. In fact, their hair had not been singed, and the smell of smoke was not on them.
Can you read verse 27?
Yes, sir. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them.
So, in other words, what King Nebuchadnezzar had thought was going to be their demise, they came out of the fire untouched, unaffected. As you read in 27, it said that the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of the fire had passed on them. So it was almost like they were in this fire, but they were protected or had some type of covering, to where not even the fire that they were in the midst of even affected the most outer layered garments, their coats, or it said the fire did not singe a hair on their head. So they were pretty much untouched, is what they noticed. And it wasn't just the king who noticed it, it was the princes, the governors and captains, and the king's counselors. They were all gathered together. So they were all witnesses to what God's power could do in the midst of His people being in that fiery furnace. So God definitely had glory in that moment. Any other comments or questions?
He made you look like you didn't even go through nothing when you come out of it. I thought you got evicted. You got a new house? What, it's bigger than the last one you had? I thought, oh, okay.
And that's one of the reasons why I get encouragement in the times where things are not how I want them to be. Because I just look at that as God must be doing something in my life. It's so easy to get distracted when you're in the moment of something, because you're so used to doing things for yourself. And that's why you have to let go of that pride, because pride means you putting yourself aside and letting God do His part. And you see how the devil can use something to work against you. And God can use the same downfall to uplift you, or to uplift you to be glorified. I think you have something.
In verse 20, it says, and he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the furnace. And then in verse 25, it says, he answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire. In verse 20, there was a command to bind them. In verse 25, they see those men that was bound loose. And then in verse 27, it says, he saw these men whose bodies of fire had no power, nor was the hair of their heads singed, and neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. So they went from being bound to free, and they was, or they use the word here, loose. They go from being bound to loose, and then the very fire that they in, they don't even smell like fire, nor do their clothes. So it talks about how God did not take the heat out of the fire the way folk may say it does.
Just people running things.
Because if he had, them folk to put them in would not have gotten killed. So the heat wasn't taken out. They was preserved in it. And when people bind you, it says God will loose you even while you are in trouble.
Yeah.
See, they was bound, and now he see a 4th person, and all 4 of them are loose. And they don't look like or smell like what they're in.
Yeah. I know after I'm done barbecuing, I smell like charcoal.
Yeah, it had.
Gas and all kinds.
That shows you the degree that God can preserve you. It talks about how even when the enemy overpowers you and you submit to it, and you're a victim of it, that God preserve you even as a victim. And so what they end up doing is totally ineffective. That's what I like about this text is you may say the enemy were successful in putting them in the fire, but the fire itself was ineffective on them because God preserved them in it.
Yeah.
And they went from being bound to loose. So the very thing that they did could be the very thing that loosed them in the fire.
And that lets you know that God was protecting them, because even after that, then they put throw somebody in and they burn up.
Which means that the heat was still hot.
Yeah, yes.
That God can
That's
preserve you in the heat. You don't have to cool the heat. Let the heat stay hot as it is,
Right.
but preserve you in it.
And we know how hot the heat get, because when we cooking and take
Yeah.
something off the stove, that's hot.
And if we go back to verse 19, the king had them turn the heat to the max.
Right.
You know, this wasn't just, some warm bath water. This was, so they were making soup.
I feel like, you know, I feel like those boys, you know, there's a whole lot of mess going on in the school corporation. But I'm preserved from all of it. I'm enjoying myself every day.
I know what to say to that.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Do you believe at some point in our life, I'll just say, without the knowledge of God, do you believe that we're subject to giving power to those circumstances?
Absolutely. So, sometimes we contribute. Those boys wasn't in there because of the king. That was a plan. And they had to remind the king, this is your word, and here's what these boys are doing. There was others that contribute to them being in there. So yeah, if we're not spiritual, we're subject to be working with the devil against God's people.
Yeah.
So absolutely we can contribute to them. You just have to be spiritually minded. That's why it's so important to be saved. Because you cannot mess with a child of God and get away with it. Whether it's intentional or unintentional.
I have had the world to say to me that those that are of God, that it doesn't matter if you are of God or not, you know, that you can die just as quick. And I realize it all depends on the person and how connected that they are to God. Because some people believe, because you know, the world is trying to say that a child of God is no different than those that are, you know, and I know that that's a big lie, but I've been fed that for years.
Yeah, well, look at this story. The very men that threw them in died, but they themselves were preserved. The truth of the matter is, we're not leaving here until the Lord get ready for us to go.
Right.
God has to give his permission for us to die. God can preserve us from dying until it's time. Just like he preserved them from dying. They ended up getting out of the fire. They didn't stay in there, they got out. And then the people that were responsible, they were thrown in. So the bottom line is a child of God like everybody else? We have a whole lot of stuff in common with them. And can we die? Yes. But we ain't dying until the Lord gives his permission.
Can you tie that into your message about the parable about when the tares were planted with the good crop and the ruler had to make a decision not to cut the tares out because it would uproot the good crop?
Well, yeah, because there's good and bad mixed together. In that particular case, you had, and both of them looked alike until it grew up. And he says, wait till harvest time, and then during harvest time, then I'll separate. So we just have to be careful on how we deal with each other. Even deal with evil folk, we have to be careful.
So it does make a difference, you know, that we live for the Lord. But I know the world will say that, you know, that it doesn't make a difference.
Well, the world's in a whole bunch of things. Yeah. We're living in a time now, and I keep saying this, wrong look like right and right look like wrong.
Yes, it does.
We're making wrong look right and the best thing to do. And then we're making right look like it's wrong, like it's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah.
And so people are saying and doing everything, but the church has to hold a standard.
Yes.
The church has to be the church, and the church has to take a stand. Regardless of what the world says, we gotta take a stand. We are the light of the world, not the world.
Yeah, right.
We are the light of the world. We are the salt of the earth. We are the city that sitteth on the hill. Which means we are the one that hold that standard. We are the one that teaches what's right. Regardless of what the world says. We gotta be the right person. We gotta do the right thing. We gotta teach the right thing.
Right.
Irregardless of what the world says. And then ultimately we gotta do the right thing. When it looks like what we're doing is not right. When I became pastor and had to discipline this church, and this church had never seen discipline before, I was the worst guy in the church. Because they never seen this before. Now, they know I'm dealing with the devil, because they've been dealing with this devil all the time. Now, as soon as I discipline this devil, ooh, look at what you're doing. That is not right. And then when them devils start leaving, because they was being disciplined, then they start saying, what are we going to do? What is the church going to do? I stood up in that pulpit and said, every one of them fellas that left, I was glad they left. Thank God they gone. And they were like, oh, wow, you said that? It was like, ooh, no. This is the Lord's house. This is where people come to become like the Lord. And if you're going to raise hell, create confusion, and keep people from learning, there's the door. And I'll hold it open while you leave. Even the school, my job at school, I'm dean of school culture. My job is to create a culture for learning. That means I discipline people who mess up that culture. That's what I do as a pastor. That's the way it goes. If the school got enough sense to do that, why don't the church?
And that's why you can't get some people to come to church, because they'll say, well, I see such and such go to church every Sunday, but then I see them Monday through Saturday, and they don't show me that they're a Christian. So why should I go to church with them for me to act worse than how they act?
Yeah, but they go to some juke joint where they fight and cussing and killing and all that stuff, and then they go right back after they do it. But then the church is the only place they don't come to because there's a problem. Where anywhere there's people, you're going to have a problem. I don't discipline folk unless what you're doing is interfering with the program of the church. And when you start doing stuff that's interfering with the program of the church, that's where you get my attention. You can do what you want to. You can live however you want to live. The church is for sinners. The sinners don't have a right to come into the church and mess up its order. I don't care what you've done. You come here. You sit and be quiet. You can worship whoever you want to do. But then when you interfere with the program of the church, then that's what gets my attention.
Question number 9. What was the king's new understanding about God? What did this king learn after what he had witnessed? After witnessing that these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were unfazed by this fire.
That's what the proclamation, verse 28 says, Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and hath changed the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Nebuchadnezzar had previously admitted that Israel's God, Yahweh, was a superior God in his ability to reveal mysteries. Now he recognized Yahweh's superior power because he had delivered the condemned men from the king's power.
So, thank you, Sister Davidson. So pretty much what she was saying, there was a previous experience that King Nebuchadnezzar had with the God of Israel. There was a time, I don't know if you remember, but there was a time where the king had a dream. And this dream, he could not interpret this dream. And he had all the wise men come to try to interpret this dream, and whoever could not interpret this dream, they would pretty much be killed. So Daniel, so he had sent out a decree to pretty much have all the wise men who could not interpret his dream to be murdered. But Daniel, being a man of God, he knew that God was a God who could answer the mysteries of people who had questions. So we learned that Daniel gave the interpretation of what God revealed the king's dream to be. And this was in chapter 2, verse 47, where it says, the king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, saying thou couldst reveal this secret. So we learn in chapter 2 that the king acknowledges the king of Israel as a superior God, but we learn in verse 26, chapter 3, verse 26, where it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God. So he went from this just being a god of other gods to being the Most High God. So this was the power that God revealed to King for him to acknowledge how powerful this God was. Not only was he more powerful than the God that he worshipped, the image that he had created, but the Jews were protected also in this fiery furnace, turned up to the max. And their God, he acknowledged their God was that powerful enough over his God and for them to escape that fiery furnace. So that's what the king learned about the God of Israel, that he was not just a superior God, but he was the Most High God. And that, any other comments or questions? And then question 10, in what way is this incident more than historical to us? We need to see more than just a historical account in this chapter. We need to see a challenge that should become a reality for us. God is still the same God who protected these young men. We can trust him just as they did. One thing that I can say is, as we read in the book of Daniel, we get caught up on what the Jews did in their obedience to God. But sometimes we can look at, we're not always obedient. And we can be like the king was in this position, where the king had acknowledged the power of God, acknowledging that he was a superior God, but not accepting this God fully. And by him not accepting this God fully, it was because he was limited to the knowledge of what he had of the God of Israel. And it took for his own sinful nature and pride that led to the three Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to be thrown into the fiery furnace. Not only did God get glory out of that situation, but the king had a new revelation of who their God was. So we can learn from that, where we may not be fully invested in God, where we know that this God and what he can do, but we can learn from the story that even when it may look as if that you're against the ropes, that same God that you thought was limited power had all power. So that was one thing that I took from this, and we should be more like the three Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and not like the king who allowed pride to blind himself of who God really was. And I think that can happen to us as well, where our sin can limit our understanding of what God can do. Because if I was in a situation, why would I not trust God 100% in my situation? It's because there's a part of me that still feels like I'm good enough to do it by myself.
Yeah.
And that's where pride comes in. And we need not to be like that king, and to allow our pride to be set aside and to be more like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so that we can trust fully in the Lord, because we know that our God that we serve has all power and is the Most High God. Amen.
Amen.
Oh, go ahead. Okay. If anybody would like to share and give any comments on what they may have learned today in today's lesson.
Well, I learned that throughout history, pride has destroyed a lot of things that could have been beneficial for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It even starts with Lucifer. Remember how God adorned him, how powerful he was. You know, he was even called the son of light. I mean, this angel was beautiful. You know, before he came to Satan, he was beautiful. I mean, God gave him everything, maybe even second in command according to the scriptures. I mean, he was just, you know, all, like I said, like second to God. But then after he saw his beauty and he saw what he was adorned in, what all God adorned him in, then he got prideful, you know, and then that's whenever he was cast down, you know. So, you know, that's a very good example. And then throughout history, you'll find out, you know, I found out through the scriptures that pride can ruin a lot of things, even in our own life. It can bring us to the lowest point. Because, you know, in this lesson, you know, it kind of goes further on with what Nebuchadnezzar suffered, you know. But that's just the point that is given me and helped me realize throughout history that pride is a very dangerous sin, and it can destroy everything that you even worked hard for.
And I see pride mainly in men, you know, just because men are usually in not take away from the women, but men are usually in leadership positions. And sometimes, you know, being in a leadership, even as a husband, you know, pride can get in the way where we're not listening to our household and saying, you know, hey, you know, I'm in need of this and need of that. And if I'm too prideful, if I'm too big, then I can be no use for someone else. So it's just a matter of being humble, because we know when we humble ourselves, God will exalt us. Whether it's we exalt ourselves, God will humble us in the way we don't want to be. Anybody else?
I know I mentioned it earlier is that even when you headed to the big challenge, when they having to your big issue, you can see it coming. God is still guide you there, and He's going to guide you out. And the example was from when the soldiers were taking the 3 men to the furnace. They burned up, but they didn't. So God is still going to keep protecting you while you're going through your trouble, when you get in trouble, and out of trouble.
I know Brother McConnell has something to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something on, well, one of the biggest things that I got is, you know, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were talking to Nebuchadnezzar, when they said that they knew that God was going to deliver them, but even if He did not, that was okay. That's one thing I've come to learn in my own personal life, that, and from experience too, that sometimes we pray for things and those prayers, we will feel like they haven't been answered, but most of the times when I look back to those unanswered prayers, I see why they were not answered. And in most times it was to protect me from myself.
Or to say I had something better for you.
Something better for me. So that's why now I'm at a point in my life where when I pray for something and it seems that it has not been answered, I am not doubtful, I am not down, because I know that there's always a reason.
Yeah, it's always a reason.
And there is spiritual timing too.
Well, I pray that everybody who heard today's lesson learned something today, and that that you can apply it in your lives.
Secretary's report. Sister Coleman's got the secretary's
Oh,
report.
secretary's report.
Okay.
Assistant.
Did Alex have a class?
I think kids are they reporting it?
Oh, they're not? Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Brother Cage.
Good evening, Sunday school. Sunday school class report. Brother Superintendent, Brother Austin, Acting Superintendent, Reverend Landon Davis. Today's date, September the 15th, 2024. Subject for today, Daniel Spring, Trust God. Student present, 15. Teachers present, 2. Class taught by Brother Lance Chronicle. Class offering, $22, reported by Sister Coleman. And I have something I just want to read that I ran across as I was studying about Nebuchadnezzar. He was a proudful person, which we all get that way sometime. But it says, the proud resist God in his understanding. Nebuchadnezzar resisted the truth of God in his passion, the providence of God. In his will, he resists the laws of God. And there is no wonder that God set himself against the proud.
All right, is there any other, do you have a class report? Okay, you just sit right there.
Really small guys with me through it all. Good job, Riri.
All right. Is there any other reports?
Good job.
All right, I move that we receive the secretary's report. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And it carries. Thank Brother Chronicle for doing such a great job today. And let us stand with a closing prayer. Father in heaven, we just thank you now, and we come to you in Jesus' name. Thank you for this lesson about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the king, the laws, and we learned that you're even greater than Nebuchadnezzar. Even when he declared that something should be done, you can even preserve us in it. Like you preserved them, we know even today you can preserve us. We pray that this lesson will be an encouragement to each one of us, especially when we find ourselves in the fiery furnace, that you would prove yourself to us, that we may know that you can preserve us even in the fire and deliver us, and there will not be any evidence that we were ever in there. These blessings and all of the blessings we ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right. God bless you. Consider yourselves dismissed.